Hi there, historians. My name is Tyler Elker. I'm going to be walking you through the life of Henry Morton Stanley. He was an explorer in the late 19th century, and so I'm going to be walking you through a few things. I'm going to go through his bio and his early childhood, as well as his personality traits and the major events and accomplishments that he had throughout his life, and his positive and negative legacies, and then I will end with a final conclusion. So, starting off with a brief bio about Henry Morton Stanley, he was born on the 20th of January 1841 in Denbigh, Wales. His parents, who were Elizabeth Perry and John Rowland, were not married, and he was the illegitimate son of them. He was brought up in a workhouse, and in 1859 he left for New Orleans. There he was befriended by a merchant, Henry Stanley, who he took upon his name. Stanley went on to serve on both sides in the American Civil War and then worked as a sailor and journalist. But before he went to America, at the age of 4, he entered the local grammar school, but 2 years later he was placed in St. Asaph Union Workhouse, where he received most of his formal education. Stanley applied himself diligently to his studies, exhibiting a trait that would endure throughout his life. Though he was a man of action who could act impatiently, his successes in Africa owed him much to the care in which he was prepared for by his school and early counseling. He had a rough childhood, moving from job to job, and even knocked out his teacher when he was 15, and never really had any close family that would accept him, not even his cousin, who had been his teacher for a short time. He earned a precarious living as a shepherd and bartender, moving from job to job in Wales. Before he crossed the border to Liverpool, where he hopped port in December of 1858, he sailed as a cabin boy aboard the Windermere, bound for New Orleans. After arriving in the United States, Stanley again ran away from a desperate situation. Jumping ship, even though he was a stranger without any prospects for employment, luck had favored him. Though he was adopted by a generous cotton broker, Henry Hope Stanley, whose name he took. The Morton was later an addition. After clerking in New Orleans and Cypress Bend, Arkansas, Stanley enlisted in the Arkansas Grays when the Civil War began. Captured by the Union forces at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1962. He shifted his allegiance rather than languish in a prison camp. This phase of his military career ended quickly, when he received a medical discharge less than a month after joining the Illinois Regiment. He then would make one further attempt to serve, signing with the Federal Navy on July 19, 1864. After seeing action off the coast of North Carolina, he jumped ship again on February 10, 1865. Stanley was then apparently born to command but not to serve. Love of travel then would actually take him to the American West and into the Middle East, where he would eventually end back in England, where he would begin to explore Africa. Now I'll be going over some of his character traits and what defined him as a person growing up during this time. Henry Morgan Stanley was actually considered very preserved for the kinds of expeditions that he set out on. His European companions marveled at what they said to be his strength of will, and the Africans actually called him Bula Matari, which means breaker of rocks. He himself wrote to the Times in 1890 that he did not consider himself to be exceptional because of his rough beginnings and kind of the education standards that he put himself, and that he considered himself to be impatient. He really loved being able to learn from the African experience, which sort of defined his expeditions and the way he pursued, how he would travel, and the ways he would actually find the other explorers, as I will talk about later in this video. However, as an explorer, a lot of people consider him being able to prevail in this wilderness setting, not because he was considered indomitable, but because he appreciated his limitations compared to other explorers such as Livingstone, who pushed himself too far and would actually die of disease. Uh, Henry Morton Stanley did not make these kinds of mistakes, and he was very calculated in how he approached his. Now I'm going to move into his major accomplishments and the events that made him as famous as he was. Before Henry Morton Stanley made it to the Middle East and Africa, he had worked for the New York Herald. Its owner, James Gordon Bennett, agreed to provide all the funds that he needed for his expeditions. Stanley accepted these terms, and through bribery, skill, and luck, he was able to be the first to report the British victory at the Battle of Magdala, thus securing a permanent spot on the staff of Bennett's paper. 2 years later, Bennett selected his young European correspondent for the mission that would make Stanley the sort of household name and change the map of Africa. Dr. David Livingstone, missionary and as well as a geographer, had first gone to Africa in 1841. In 1866, he set out to find the source of the Nile River, but soon disappeared. As concern for his safety began to mount, Bennett asked Stanley to find and resupply the missing explorer. Bennett's concern, though, was more journalistic than sort of humanitarian. He recognized that Stanley's story would do a lot for the Herald. However, to be sure that the newspaper would have a good copy, regardless of the outcome of the expedition rescue effort, Bennett first sent Stanley to cover the opening of the Suez Canal. On November 17th, in 1869, he filed a series of reports on the Middle East. Therefore, Stanley could not begin his search for Livingstone until early 1871. On November 10th, 1871, he finally had his chance after overcoming bad weather, disease, and hostile communities. Stanley found that the man he was seeking greeting him with the words that would soon echo throughout Europe and America. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That would be a famous quote that would move on throughout further expeditions and kind of highlight his expedition lifestyle. Stanley had given the Herald his stories, and he had saved Livingstone, whose supplies were almost completely exhausted and was suffering from dysentery. Livingstone tried to persuade Stanley to join him in his great quest for the source of the Nile, but Stanley argued that Livingstone should return to England. He was neither convinced, on the other hand, but Stanley was clearly captivated by the missionary and by Africa. Even though he was eager to tell his story to the Western world, Stanley tarried at Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika until March 14th, 1872. Even after all of these successes, in August 1872, he bitterly described the treatment he had received from the Royal Geographical Society and the British upper classes. First, they would kind of sneer at the fact that he was an American, first of all, that went to Central Africa, and that he sneered at the idea of him actually being successful. In the midst of his speeches, dinners, and honors and receptions, Stanley found time to write two books about his recent adventures. He wrote How I Found Livingstone in 1872 and My Kalulu in 1873. The first book, How I Found Livingstone, would become a national and worldwide success. On November 17th, 1874, he plunged into the African jungle again, determined to cross the continent from east to west, locate the source of the Nile, and chart the unknown regions of Africa. Stanley's 1874 expedition would go down as one of the most audacious journeys within the history of the African exploration, at least at the time. Over the course of his nearly 1,000 days, he partly and successfully trekked into the continent's central water sources and scoured its lake in a 24-foot boat. Such a fate offered great rewards and equally large challenges. The weather could be oppressively hot, and torrential rains could quickly turn a campsite into a muddy quagmire. The Africans who actually supplied them had often proved unreliable and would desert, or worse, they would actually almost commit mutiny. Dysentery, malaria, and typhus took a heavy toll, and Stanley actually lost most of his men throughout most of his expeditions due to the diseases that they contracted. And he himself would actually contract later on. Even though hostile tribes posed a lot of the danger, a single battle at Vinyata, 21 people were killed by the Nyaturi warriors. Within 3 months, however, Stanley had lost more than half of his original caravan, mostly to disease, though. He also, during this time, had lost a lot of weight when he reached his final destination. He was 118 pounds by the end when he started out at 178 pounds, showing the kind of toll the expedition had actually taken on him, and this only proves the harsh conditions that he actually had to go through in order to complete his expeditions. After Lake Tanganyika, he headed north along the river Lualaba River, taking a route that no European had actually ever followed, and one that Africans feared they would never be able to see him again due to the cannibals living there. By choosing to go north rather than south, he would conduct geographical surveys. Not only did he discover that Stanley Falls and Stanley Pool, as they would later be called, but he was also able to demonstrate that finally the Lualaba was part of the Congo rather than the Nile River. Moreover, he would become the first European to travel the length of the Congo, and the waterfalls and rapids blocked the way from the west, and previously the jungle had actually denied any access from the east. When Stanley actually had hoped to end the slave trade in Central Africa, he also wanted to Christianize the Africans and improve their maternal living, or their material living, through commerce with the West. Events, however, would prove that these plans were kind of an illusion, and Stanley's explorations would open the western half of the continent to Arab slave traders and equally exploitive European empire or imperial builders. Stanley, however, was largely unaware of his perversions of his dreams when he agreed to return to the Congo for the King Leopold II of Belgium. He would have preferred British support, however, England was not interested. Between 1879 and 1882, he surpassed the king's expectations, founding Leopoldville and building a 300-mile wagon road from the Atlantic to Stanley Pool, and creating a small fleet to navigate the upper Congo River and further beyond. Because of these efforts, Belgium would receive a 900,000 square mile area in the continent that they would control for the rest and into the majority of the 20th century. Stanley's last expedition in Africa was actually not one that you would actually maybe consider. It was a relief mission for Mehmed Emin Passa, the governor of the province of Egypt, and he had been cut off by the Mahdist revolt of 1882 in the in the areas of Lake Albert. Stanley was appointed to lead the relief expedition and decided to approach Lake Albert by the way of the Congo River, counting on the Tipu Tib to supply the porters. Stanley had left England in 1887 and arrived at the mouth of the Congo in March. The expedition, however, reached the navigable head of the river in June, and there Stanley left a rear column with orders to await Tipu Tib's porters. The failure, however, of the real column to rejoin the main body gave rise to controversy harmful to Stanley's reputation. Eventually, the expedition was assembled at Lake Albert, and despite Amin's initial reluctance to leave his province, some 1,500 personnel set out to the East Coast on April 10th, 1889, and arrived at the Bagamovo on December 4th. On his way there, however, it revealed that explorers for the first time had identified the mountains and the Semliki River, which had never been seen before, and the lakes of Edward and Albert. Thus, they were cleared up the few doubtful geographic points regarding the Nile sources. When he had finally reached the governor, or the German governor, he realized that they did not actually need supplies. And even though he actually came to their aid, they would evacuate that province and leave it entirely due to lack of ammunition. However, I'm now going to go into his positive and negative legacies. After he returned from his expedition in 1890, he had married his wife Dorothy Tennant on July 12th, and they adopted a son named Denzil Stanley. While he was a British subject in 1892, after renewing his citizenship with England, he also sat in Parliament as a Liberal Unionist for the North Lambeth from 1895 to 1900. And in 1897, he visited South Africa and wrote his famous book, Through South Africa, in 1898. He even was made a knight called the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath in 1899 by Queen Victoria herself, and he was named Sir Henry Morton Stanley. The remaining years before his death was spent mostly at Furze Hill near Pirbright, Surrey, a small estate that he bought in 1898. Stanley's expeditions, however, significantly altered the understanding of Africa's geography, including the navigation of the Congo River and the discovery of the important lakes, and even circumnavigating what would later be known as Lake Victoria. Despite his initial intentions to promote commerce and end the slave trade, his ventures actually made things worse for a lot of the African population that lived there on the continent, especially in the Congo when the Belgians began to occupy it. He played a key role in establishing the Congo Free State, which would later be notorious for its brutal exploitation. Later in life, however, Stanley faced a bunch of complex issues regarding his legacy, as his contributions were overshadowed by the atrocities associated with colonialism, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. Upon his death in 1904, he was denied burial in Westminster Abbey, where he had hoped to rest alongside Livingstone, reflecting not only his expeditions, but also the historical impact he made on the African continent. Stanley, however, remains a figure of both exploration and controversy, raising questions about the dualities of discovery and the exploitations that would later lead to the scramble for Africa. Today he was remembered for his amazing achievements. However, because of the results of everything that he had discovered, he is often looked down upon because of that external result. However, I kind of believe that is unfair, because considering everything that he actually did in creating the geographic maps of those regions that no one in Europe had really seen before. Although the populations were directly effective, I believe that those are two separate issues, and even though he could considered to be naive, I do not believe that he was doing it for hostile intent. In conclusion, I would say that he was a great explorer and he helped achieve a lot of the things that he set out to do. But in terms of what actually ended up happening, he was probably the person that shouldn't, or at least if he knew that it was going to lead to the exploitation of Africa, it is hard to argue he would still go through it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.